Good evening and welcome to Global Communication Live. My name is Cindy Chai. Our story tonight is looking at how national and international media cover global issues. Our analysis will particularly focus on the global movement for women's rights through marches and protests. Given the rise of the women's rights movement, it's important to look at how it is portrayed in the media. By examining news coverage from CNN, an American global media network, and comparing their coverage with Al Jazeera, a news program based in Qatar, we can better make sense of how different media networks present women's issues. We will first focus on how these news networks use agenda-setting theory, which states that the media sets the agenda for public issues. We will then move to framing theory, which examines the way in which the media portray the news. Finally, we will examine the possible bias of these two news networks. So, follow me as I untangle the media's coverage of the Women's March movement. The fight for gender equality can be dated back to as early as 1792, when English writer and philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which advocates equal treatment as well as equal access to education for women and men. Since then, women have worked hard to pave a way for gender equality across the globe. Through strength and hard work, many women have gained suffrage as well as rights that liberate them from workplace and sexual discrimination. However, women around the world still experience gender-based violence and discrimination. In 2016, almost 300 women were murdered in Argentina, where it is uncommon for women to receive help from abusive partners. Because of this, thousands of women went on the streets of Argentina on March 8, 2017, also known as International Women's Day, to protest against domestic abuse. Inequality of women in the workplace has additionally created tension in several countries, including the UK, where 15 million working women are missing out on $190 billion each year. For these and many other reasons, the March for Women's Rights has become a valuable piece to the movement. Over the course of history, women and men have taken to the streets to protest against gender inequality. The women's marches on January 21, 2017, broke records with an estimated number of 6 million people attending marches around the world. The 2017 Women's March on Washington stands as the largest one-day protest in America. Attempting to rewrite a system based on patriarchy and female oppression, women have launched a popular movement devoted to create transformative social change. Women's March is a global grassroots movement started in response to the Women's March on Washington. This movement encourages nonviolent resistance and has sparked the creation of more than 600 sister marches around the world. Recently, the protests for women's rights have become a popular online topic, specifically the hashtag #MeToo movement, which connects and strengthens victims of sexual assault, has created its own online strike. Against all odds, women are calling out systems of power to reform policy in the name of gender equality. As we begin to analyze the media's coverage on the Women's March movement, we will keep some questions in mind. How do national and international media frame the news on women's rights? What words or concepts are used to describe the Women's March movement? How is the news on the Women's March movement different in America from the rest of the world? The articles I reference in this analysis were published between 2016 and 2018. I have gathered 5 articles from CNN, a major American news network with liberal-oriented coverage. In addition, I have gathered 6 articles from Al Jazeera, a news network from Doha, Qatar, in the Middle East where media usually conforms to government pressure. I also gathered information from other credible articles and research outside of the 2 news outlets. From there, I individually analyzed CNN and Al Jazeera's stories. I first examined how CNN and Al Jazeera presented their news stories. I then looked for use of certain language and tone. I wanted to know how these networks perceive the Women's March movement. According to the Pew Research Center, CNN's ideology is categorized as more liberal to the average respondent. This was clear when I observed the overall tone from the stories. Almost all of the stories focused on honoring the fight for gender equality and denounced U.S. President Trump and his policies. For example, one article about the Power to the Polls march in Las Vegas quoted the moments when the American singer Cher denounced Trump. While further analyzing CNN's stories on the Women's March, I noticed some interesting patterns. First, all of the stories from the 2018 marches included the fact that these marches had taken place a year after the Women's March on Washington. The Women's March on Washington is a historical marker for the beginning of many sister marches around the world. So, it's clear to see that CNN wants to create a strong sense of American pride when discussing the global movement for women's rights. Another pattern I noticed in CNN stories are the amount of quotes and photos used in their articles. International Women's Day 2018 sparked protests all over the globe, including in Madrid, where women marched in refusal to work because of the large pay gap and increasing violence against women. CNN described this strike by reporting factual evidence and then following it with quotes from demonstrators. The article included several photos from the event, which highlights these women's strength and resilience. CNN's use of images and quotes act as a tool to influence viewers to become active in the Women's March movement. 3 of the 5 articles included photos and videos with babies and children at the marches, and 1 article was even dedicated solely to the signs held up during protests. In all of the articles from CNN, women are portrayed as strong grassroots activists. The focus on many of the stories is the fact that so many women are coming together around the world for a united cause. When it comes to our international news source located in Doha, Qatar, the Women's March movement has not yet reached their local streets. According to the 2017 World Report by the Human Rights Watch, laws in Doha still abuse women's basic human rights. Under Qatar's Law Number 22 for Family and Personal Status, Article 58 states that it is a wife's responsibility to look after the household and to obey her husband. With the obstacles that women in Qatar face, Al Jazeera's news on women's rights is largely focused on the global movement, with strong influence from the United States. Out of the 5 articles I found, 3 of them mentioned the Women's March on Washington and protests against Donald Trump. Additionally, their stories focused on giving information and context as to where and why people are marching. In their story about the Women's March on Washington, they explained why protesters were wearing pink cat-eared hats and why women were calling themselves a nasty woman. Compared to CNN, Al Jazeera reports more on the global movement. When covering the strikes against femicide in Latin America, Al Jazeera focuses on the stories of the victims who are now leading women in the fight for women's rights. For example, a video from Al Jazeera Buenos Aires focuses their lead on the story of Karina Abregu and how 55% of her body was burned by her ex-husband. Al Jazeera consistently includes more facts and details about the violence and discrimination that women are protesting against. As a result, Al Jazeera's news carries a tone that will tug at the viewers' heartstrings and leave them with a positive attitude towards the Women's March movement. To further analyze CNN's style of reporting, we must apply the agenda setting theory and framing theory. Agenda setting is drawn from the idea that the media tells us what to think about, thereby creating the public agenda. Framing, then, says that the media will focus on certain angles of events in order to persuade the public to feel a certain way. Applying these theories to CNN, we see that this global news channel centers many of their stories on the women's rights movement in America. As discussed earlier, every story included information about protests in the U.S. CNN also appears to report heavily on the marches that happened a year after the Women's March on Washington. Although they tie it to a global movement, they make it a priority to include events in the U.S. Through personal interviews and photos, CNN frames the Women's March movement as a grassroots movement. Words like together, change, and resist are seen in many of the quotes from CNN's articles, and these words carry strong emotions. As a result, CNN takes a liberal bias in the news. Applying agenda setting to Al Jazeera, we see that their news places heavy significance on the global aspect of the Women's March movement. Al Jazeera specifically frames their stories around victims who have suffered extremely violent abuse. In the article about the march in Argentina, Al Jazeera reports that nearly 300 women in Argentina had been murdered in 1 year. The article also includes the video with Karina Abregu's in-depth interview, where we are told of her horrific abuse and how she was able to overcome and become a leader for her people. In addition to using words like murdered, violent, abusive, and protection, Al Jazeera uses videos like these to leave viewers with avid feelings towards the Women's March movement. The demand for justice is a powerful way to frame the news. In doing so, Al Jazeera's news reads slightly biased towards liberal ideologies. The Women's March movement has sparked political and social activism around the world. The fight for gender equality is a difficult and ongoing process. CNN and Al Jazeera both portray the movement as rooted in grassroots mentality and use this to draw viewers towards the movement. Both news channels also exhibit a liberal bias, although their stories rely on a heavy amount of factual reporting. Realizing that these news channels frame their stories to draw emotion, we as viewers need to pay close attention to the media's role in the public agenda. This means obtaining evidence from multiple sources, and most importantly, becoming an active member in your local area. By doing so, you can be a part of a global movement. This is Cindy Chai for Global Communication Live. Thank you and good night.